The furnace had not been lit in 60 years. It was still there when Edmund found it, the glory hole furnace, set into the back wall of the abandoned workshop on the edge of Harwick Fen, its firebox sealed with refractory brick and 60 years of cold. The workbench ran the length of the south wall. The north-facing skylight threw the steady, shadowless light that glassworkers had always needed. He had paid $6 at a county auction where nobody else raised their hand. His son had cleared his home and workshop into storage 14 days before that, without asking, and driven him to a care home near the county line. His daughter had adjusted her seatbelt strap the entire drive, pulling it from her neck and releasing it, over and over, as if it were the only available thing to hold. What Edmund found inside the firebox of that furnace, sealed behind the refractory brick for 60 years, was something nobody had known to look for. But I need to take you back to the beginning. Edmund had made his first piece of glass at 16. It was a marble. Nothing complicated, nothing that required the years of skill that would come later. Just a small, clear sphere with a twist of cobalt blue pulled through the center, made at the torch in his uncle's workshop on a Saturday morning when his uncle had left him alone with the equipment for an hour and told him not to burn himself. He had not burned himself. He had made a marble, and when it had cooled and he held it up to the light from the workshop window, the cobalt blue twisting through the clear glass like a thought through water. He had understood something about himself that he had not understood before. He had kept it in his trouser pocket every day for 59 years. The work that followed that marble was 40 years of lamp-working and scientific glass-blowing, the making of precision instruments for research laboratories and universities, and the smaller, more personal work of flame-worked pieces for collectors who understood what they were holding. Scientific glass-blowing was a craft that required the understanding of heat and material at a cellular level, the knowledge of how different glass compositions responded to the torch flame, how to work within the narrow temperature windows that allowed the glass to be shaped without cracking or straining, how to join different compositions without the thermal mismatch that would eventually cause a piece to fail. Edmund had learned this knowledge over years and had then added to it continuously over 4 decades, building an understanding of glass that was his own, accumulated from the intersection of chemistry and patience and the particular quality of attention that the material demanded. He had a workshop of his own from the age of 31, a converted outbuilding at the back of the house he and his wife Marion had bought in the first year of their marriage. Marion had taught secondary school mathematics with the same precision and patience that Edmund brought to glass, and she had understood his work from the inside, the way one practitioner of a precise discipline recognized another, and had given him the particular quality of space that the work required, not absence, but a present and informed distance, close enough to understand, far enough not to interrupt. The workshop produced 2 distinct streams of work for 40 years. The scientific commissions paid the bills. Custom glassware for university laboratories, replacement components for instruments that could not be sourced commercially, the specialized vessels and tubes and chambers that experimental science depended on and that most scientists thought about only when they broke. These commissions required exactness and reliability and an understanding of material behavior under stress that Edmund had accumulated over years, and he delivered them with the consistency of someone for whom the work was both livelihood and vocation. The second stream was smaller, more personal, and more entirely his own. Flame-worked pieces made at the torch rather than at the furnace, the work of hours rather than days, objects in which the glass was doing something that the scientific commissions did not require it to do, which was to be beautiful in a way that had no further justification. He made these pieces for collectors who understood what they were holding, people who could read the quality of the work in the glass itself, the way the flame had moved through it, the decisions made in the seconds when the glass was in its working range and open to being something it had not been before. He sold some and kept some and gave some away to people he thought would understand them. Marion died 3 years before the story begins, after a long illness that had taken most of those 3 years to complete. Edmund had been present through all of it in the way that mattered, which meant that the work had receded, not stopped, but receded. The torch lit for shorter periods, the commissions taken more selectively, the focus shifting to what was happening in the house rather than what was happening at the bench. After Marion died, Conrad began to manage. Conrad was 48, Edmund's son, a property developer who had spent his adult career identifying undervalued assets and converting them to more productive uses, and who applied this framework with genuine conviction that he was being helpful to his father's situation. The workshop output was declining. The house was too large. Edmund had been confused about a medication schedule once, which Conrad had noted and retained, and eventually presented as evidence of a pattern that Edmund himself did not recognize. Each of these things was addressed with the methodical efficiency of a man who had never found a problem that could not be resolved by the correct application of planning. He cleared Edmund's workshop contents into a storage unit on a Wednesday. He told Edmund afterward, presenting it as a practical step, a way of protecting the equipment while the living situation was sorted out. He meant this. He did not understand that what he had done was remove the only part of Edmund's daily life that was still fully his. Beatrix was 41, Edmund's daughter, a primary school librarian who loved her father clearly and acted on that love in ways that stopped short of the things that would have actually helped. She called every week. She came at Christmas. She was present and warm in all of those contacts, and she did not come when she should have come, and she did not say what she should have said. On a gray Tuesday morning, Conrad arrived with the car running and the explanation prepared. A care home near the county line, recommended by a colleague, good staff, a garden, people Edmund's age. Just while things were being sorted out, Edmund went to the bedside table and picked up the glass marble. It was cold from the night, the cobalt blue at its center catching the morning light from the window. He put it in his trouser pocket where it had lived for 59 years. In the car, Beatrix sat in the passenger seat. She had her seatbelt fastened, and throughout the drive she pulled the strap away from her neck with 2 fingers and released it, pulled it and released it, the webbing snapping gently back each time, her eyes on the road ahead and not on her father in the back seat. She did this for 40 minutes without appearing to notice she was doing it. Edmund watched his daughter's hand on the seatbelt and said nothing. The care home was everything Conrad had described and nothing that Edmund intended to remain in. The room was comfortable. The garden was maintained. The staff were kind. Edmund was courteous to everyone and spent his evenings at the table by the window with the glass marble in his hand, turning it over and over in the light from the bedside lamp, the cobalt blue moving through its center as the sphere turned. He thought about heat. He thought about the quality of the light through a north-facing skylight. He thought about the particular smell of a glass workshop, the hot mineral smell of the furnace and the cleaner, colder smell of the torch work, the smell of glass becoming something it had not been before. He thought about what he had. He had a savings account that Conrad did not control, maintained separately since the year Marion's illness began, money kept in reserve against a future that had now arrived in a form he had not specified but that he was capable of addressing. He had the marble in his trouser pocket, the first thing he had ever made, the proof that his hands had always known what they were for. He had 40 years of knowledge of heat and material and form, the kind of knowledge that lived in the hands and in the eyes, and in the accumulated judgment of a craftsman who had been doing the same thing for a very long time and had never stopped learning from it. He had, he realized, everything he needed except a place to use it. He spent his mornings at the library, which was a mile from the care home, and which he walked to each day because the walk was useful thinking time. He used the computers to search for properties. He looked at the county listings and the delinquent tax rolls and the surplus property notices. He was patient and systematic because patience and system were how he had always worked, and he was not in a hurry because hurrying in glasswork produced broken glass, and he suspected the same was true of life. On the 10th day, he found the county tax listings. On the 13th day, he read the entry for the abandoned glassblower's workshop on the edge of Harwick Fen. He read it 3 times. The listing mentioned a north-facing skylight. It mentioned original equipment remaining in situ. He did not need to read further. On the 14th day, he paid $6 at the county office and took the bus to Harwick Fen. The workshop was at the edge of the town, where the buildings gave way to the flat fenland, a single-story brick structure set slightly back from the road, its north roof plane entirely glazed in the manner of purpose-built studio spaces, the glass dirty but intact. He stood in front of it for a long moment, reading the building the way he always read any new space, for what it told him about what had happened inside it and what could happen there again. He unlocked the door. The smell hit him before the light adjusted, the particular mineral cold of a space that had held heat for decades and had been cold for decades since, the trace of old furnace work still present in the brick and the floor, and the air, in a way that did not entirely dissipate even after 60 years. He stood in the doorway and breathed it in. The workbench, the furnace, the light. He spent the first day on a thorough assessment of the workshop, moving through it systematically the way he had always assessed a new working space, from the structure that held everything to the equipment to the practical logistics of a working day. The building was sound. The north skylight was intact across its full length, the glazing dirty but uncracked, the framing in good condition. The workbench ran the full south wall, its surface worn smooth by the generations of hands that had worked there, its timber still solid. He tested each section and found the length of it true. The furnace was the central question. He crouched at the firebox opening on the morning of the 2nd day and looked into the firebox with a torch, reading the condition of the refractory brick lining that determined whether the furnace could be safely relit and what work would be required to bring it to operating condition. The original lining was in the state that 60 years of disuse produced, not destroyed, not compromised in any structural sense, but dried and settled in ways that would need a dressing before heat could be safely applied. He calculated the reline requirements and the sequence and the materials he would need, and wrote it all in the small notebook he carried in his shirt pocket. And in the back of the firebox, at the base of the rear wall, the section of different brick. He saw it on the first inspection and did not touch it. He catalogued it in his notebook with the same factual precision he brought to everything else, noted the different color and texture and the newer mortar, and continued his assessment. He came back to it that evening when the rest of the work was recorded and the sequence was clear, and he had time to think about what he was looking at. He was still crouching at the firebox when a voice behind him said that she had been watching from across the road and was not trying to be strange about it, but she wanted to ask him something. Orla ran the hardware and materials supply shop 2 streets into the town, a narrow premises that had been supplying the practical needs of Harwick Fen for 30 years, and that smelled of oil and timber and the metal and mineral smell that Edmund recognized from his own supply purchasing over 4 decades. She was in her early 60s, a compact woman with short silver hair and the directness of someone who had been answering practical questions for a living for a long time and had no patience for going around anything that could be addressed directly. She said she wanted to ask him how he had read the brickwork so quickly. He told her. The color variation in the refractory brick, the way the heat distribution pattern changed at the back of the firebox, the slightly different installation of the section near the base of the rear wall. He told her in the terms of a glass worker talking to someone who had asked, which were different from the terms he used when explaining to someone who had not. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "You have worked furnaces like this." He said he had worked furnaces like this for 40 years. She looked at him. She looked at the furnace. She said that she had a stockroom full of glass supplies from a studio that had closed the previous year, and that she had been unable to sell because the local glass community was small and the materials were specialized, and that if he could use them, she would rather they were used than stored. She also said that there was a room above the shop, if he needed somewhere to be while he got the workshop going, and that the rent would be whatever he could manage. He said he was grateful. She said, "Do not be grateful yet. The furnace needs a complete reline before it can be lit, and I do not know a refractory contractor inside 50 miles. He said he knew how to reline a furnace. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "Right then." The section of different brick came away with careful work on the second day, after Edmund had spent the first day on a thorough assessment of the workshop, cataloguing what was present and what was needed, and the sequence of work that would be required to make the space functional. He worked the loosened bricks out one at a time, setting each one aside in order, and behind them, recessed into the original rear wall of the firebox, a fireclay box. Square, perhaps 10 inches on a side, its surface bearing the particular combination of heat glazing and carbon staining of something that had spent decades inside a furnace, protected from the worst of it by the layer of brick, but touched by enough heat to mark it permanently. He lifted it out carefully and carried it to the workbench. The lid came off with a quarter turn. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth that had survived their decades in better condition than he had any right to expect, a set of notebooks. He counted them without opening any. 7, each one a standard laboratory notebook, their covers reinforced with cloth tape that had darkened with age. He lifted the first one and opened it at the beginning. The handwriting was precise and small, the handwriting of a man accustomed to annotating his own work in the margins of his process. The first page carried a name and a date. August Ferris, Harwick Fen Workshop, 1912. Below it, the first entry, a glass formula, written out in the notation Edmund recognized as the notation of a working scientific glassblower, the precise ratios of silica and boron and alumina, and the modifiers that determined the final properties of the glass, followed by working notes on the behavior of the composition at different stages of the process. He turned pages slowly, formula after formula, 40 years of development, the compositions becoming progressively more refined, the notes becoming more specific as Ferris's understanding of his materials deepened. The notebooks recorded a technical education conducted entirely in the privacy of this workshop, a man teaching himself more than the field had yet formally understood by doing the work and writing down what the work told him. In the 5th notebook, marked with a strip of red cloth tape at the edge, a formula that was different from the rest, more complex, the ratios tighter, the working notes longer and more specific, cross-references to earlier notebooks in the margins showing the years of refinement that had led to this page. At the top of the page, in Ferris's small hand, this one. Below the formula, a single line, clearer than Pyrex, more stable above 700, does not strain. Edmund read the formula 3 times. He understood, reading it, what he was holding. A glass composition developed over what the surrounding notebooks suggested were several years of systematic experimentation, a borosilicate formula that addressed specific limitations of the commercial equivalents available in Ferris's era. If the formula was what the notes claimed, and Edmund's reading of it suggested it was, this was a significant technical achievement that had sat in a firebox for 60 years, unknown to anyone. He set the fifth notebook carefully to one side and worked through the remaining two. More formulas, more refinements. The last entry in the seventh notebook was dated 1951 and was unfinished, the sentence ending mid-notation, as if Ferris had been called away from the bench and had not returned. Beneath the notebooks, wrapped separately in a piece of the same oilcloth, something that clinked softly when he moved it. He unwrapped it carefully. 12 glass fish, each one perhaps 3 inches long, each one a different species, each one made with the flame-working precision of a craftsman at the height of their powers. The fins and scales and the particular quality of the glass itself all speaking to the same hands that had written those notebooks in their small, careful script. He held the first one up to the skylight and turned it slowly. The glass was the finest he had held in years, clear and without strain, the movement of the flame visible in the way the form had been built, each decision made at the right moment. On the belly of each fish, in a thread of red glass laid into the surface, a signature AF in the looping initials of August Ferris. He lined them up on the workbench in the afternoon light from the skylight and looked at them. 12 fish, each one distinct, each one privately made, never part of the commercial output of the workshop. Ferris's own work, the work he did for himself, made in the same room where he developed the formulas and ran the furnace and filled the notebooks with 40 years of careful thought. He was wrapping the last fish back in its oilcloth when he noticed the small package at the bottom of the box that he had set aside without unwrapping. He picked it up. It was lighter than the fish packages and made a different sound. He unwrapped it. It was not a fish. It was a small glass figure, perhaps 2 inches tall, a woman seated in a chair, her head slightly bent, her hands in her lap, holding the suggestion of a book, made in the same flame-worked style as the fish, with the same quality of attention to the small details that made the difference between an object and a presence. On the base, in the same red glass thread as the fish, A.F. He held her up to the light from the skylight. Nobody who came to the workshop would ever be able to explain why August Ferris had put her among the fish. Edmund would set her on the windowsill where the morning light came through her, and she would be there every morning when the work began, and every person who worked in the workshop would eventually stop what they were doing and look at her when the light was right. Nobody would know who she was, but she would be known. He told Orla about the notebooks and the fish and the figure that evening over the dinner she had made without asking whether he wanted it. Orla listened with the practical attentiveness she brought to everything, and when he finished, she said that the formula needed to go to someone who could assess it properly, and that she knew the materials science department at the university 2 counties over, and that she would make contact in the morning. Edmund said he was grateful. She said, "You said that before. It still does not apply." Nell arrived 3 weeks after Edmund in response to the notice he had put up at the library, Glassblower's workshop being restored, seeking anyone with experience of scientific or laboratory glasswork. She had read it twice and driven to Harwick Fen that afternoon. She was 58, a former laboratory technician who had spent 30 years working with precision glass instruments in university research laboratories, responsible for the maintenance and repair and occasional fabrication of the glassware that experimental science depended on and that most scientists never thought about until it broke. She had taken early retirement when the department she worked in closed and had been filling the gap with activities that came close to but did not reach the particular quality of satisfaction she had found in the glass work. She walked into the workshop and looked at the workbench and the furnace and the tools that Edmund had laid out in order along the bench, and she said, "You have set it up for production, not display." He said, "It is a working workshop." She said, "Good. Then I can be useful." She moved her things into the room above the workshop the following week. She was immediately and substantively useful in the way of someone who understands a discipline from a different angle than the person leading it and whose different angle covers different ground. She knew the scientific glass supply chain from the laboratory procurement side, which meant she knew where to source the specific materials that Edmund needed, and at what price and from whom, and on what lead time, information that had taken Edmund years to accumulate from the production side and that Nell had accumulated comparably from the other direction. She also had, from 30 years of laboratory work, a thorough knowledge of what broke in scientific glassware and why and under what conditions, which was exactly the knowledge that a glassblower needed when designing pieces for laboratory use. The craftsman and the technician approached the material from opposite ends of its working life, and the conversation between those two perspectives, which began in the first week and did not stop, produced a quality of work that Edmund had not been able to achieve alone. The workshop also benefited from Nell's organizational intelligence, which was of a different order from Edmund's. He made excellent glass. He kept excellent records of his formulas and his techniques. He was not a natural administrator of the non-glass aspects of a working studio, the scheduling and the invoicing and the correspondence and the supply management. Nell was. She absorbed these responsibilities within the first month without being asked to and without making anything of it, the way people with that particular capability absorbed necessary work because the work needed to be done and they could see how to do it. Nell's particular human moment came on a Wednesday evening in her third week, when Edmund came into the workshop after supper to check on a piece he had left annealing in the kiln and found Nell at the workbench, not working, not reading, just sitting on the workbench stool with one of August Ferris's glass fish in her hands, turning it over slowly under the lamp. She was not examining it technically. She was simply looking at it with the particular quality of attention that people brought to things that were more beautiful than they had expected. She heard him come in and looked up. She said, "I have been looking at this for 20 minutes. He said, "Which one?" She said, "The bream, the scales." He said, "He made the scales from a single thread of glass, each one pulled individually and set in place." She looked back at the fish. She said, "That is not possible." He said, "Look at the base of each scale." She looked. After a moment she said, "Oh." She set the fish down very carefully on the workbench and looked at it for another moment and then went back to what she had been doing before supper, which was the inventory of the glass stock from Orla's stockroom. Jasper arrived 4 weeks after Nell, on foot, with a backpack and the particular quality of someone who had learned to move through the world, making as small an impression as possible. He was 21, a care leaver who had spent 3 years between addresses and temporary situations, and he had heard about the workshop from a support worker who had heard about it from the library notice. He said he did not know anything about glass, but that he could be patient and careful, and that he was not afraid of heat. Edmund looked at him for a moment. He said that patience and careful were the 2 most important qualifications, and that the heat part could be learned. He showed Jasper the glass figure on the windowsill that morning before he showed him anything else in the workshop. He explained what it was, and where it had come from, and who had made it, and that nobody knew who she was. Jasper stood at the windowsill and looked at her in the morning light for a while. Then he said, "She looks like she is comfortable." Edmund said, "Yes, she does." Jasper stayed. He came in every morning before anyone else and lit the small electric kettle in the workshop corner and made tea and had it ready when Edmund arrived. He did not announce this practice. He simply did it. Within the first week, it had become the way mornings began in the workshop, and within the second week, it had become a thing that all 4 of them, Edmund and Nell and Orla when she came, counted on in the way of small rituals that organize a shared day. What became clear in the first week was that Jasper had, without any prior experience of glass or fire or precision work, the quality that Edmund had encountered perhaps 10 times in 40 years, and that could not be taught because it was not a skill but a disposition, the capacity to be still in front of a process, to watch without interfering, to wait for the material to tell him what it needed rather than imposing his own timeline on it. Glasswork punished impatience. It punished force. It rewarded exactly the kind of attentive patience that Jasper had developed through no easy route, as a way of surviving a world that had not been particularly careful with him. Edmund began teaching him. Not with explanations, but with demonstration, the way the craft had always been taught at its best, the student watching the master's hands until the hands began to understand, without the head needing to translate. He gave Jasper simple exercises at the cold torch first, the manipulation of glass rods, the development of the physical relationship with the material before any heat was applied. Jasper worked through them with a seriousness and a patience that Edmund found, after 40 years of teaching, genuinely unusual. Jasper's particular human moment came on a Sunday afternoon in the 5th week, when Edmund found him at the cold torch at the end of the workbench, not lit, just sitting with a glass rod in his hands and his eyes closed. He was not doing anything. He was feeling the weight and temperature of the glass rod in his hands, getting to know the material before he worked with it. It was something Edmund had told him to do on the first day, and that Jasper had been doing every day since, always at the cold torch, always with eyes closed, always for the same 10 minutes before anything else. Edmund stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him. Then he went to the other end of the bench and lit his own torch, and began the work he had planned for that morning. The commission that brought Edmund back to the torch after 3 years came through Nell, who had contacted her former colleagues in the university laboratory network and mentioned carefully and specifically that a scientific glassblower of 40 years' experience was working again and was taking commissions. A materials science professor contacted them the following week with a requirement for a set of specialized reaction vessels that could not be sourced commercially at the specification he needed. Edmund lit the torch on a Tuesday morning. He had the glass marble out of his trouser pocket and set on the workbench where he could see it, the cobalt blue catching the light from the skylight. He had carried it for 59 years, and he had never before taken it out and put it on the bench while he worked. He did it that morning because the morning felt like it needed a witness of some kind, something that had been present at the beginning and could be present at this beginning too. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put on his safety glasses and adjusted the torch flame to the temperature he needed and took up the first glass rod and began. He worked for 40 minutes on the first vessel, building the form in the way his hands had always built it, not from the outside in, but from the inside out, starting from the interior geometry that the professor's specification required and letting the exterior follow from that. The glass moved the way it had always moved under his hands, with the particular responsiveness of a material that had its own logic and rewarded understanding of that logic with a quality of result that force could never produce. The hand remembered. The eye remembered. The judgment that told him when the glass was at the right moment for each decision. That narrow window of workability that closed without warning if you missed it, remembered too. 3 years away from the torch had not taken any of it. It had been waiting the way the workshop had been waiting, the way the formula had been waiting in the firebox for 60 years. He did not look up from the work. Jasper, at the end of the workbench, where he had been working on a basic tube sealing exercise, had stopped his own work and was watching. He had not moved in 40 minutes. He sat completely still on his stool with his hands on his knees and his eyes on Edmund's hands at the torch, watching the glass being formed, the flame doing its work, the vessel taking its shape. He did not say anything. Edmund set the finished vessel in the annealing kiln and looked up. He looked at Jasper, sitting completely still at the end of the bench. he said. "What did you see?" Jasper said. "I saw you listening to it." Edmund looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, that is exactly what it is. If you have made it this far into Edmund's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. The materials science professor who came to assess the Ferris notebooks was a woman named Priya, who arrived 3 weeks after Orla had made the initial contact with the university. She came with a materials scientist's precision and a historian's patience and spent the better part of a day with the notebooks, working through the formulas with the attention of someone checking the mathematics of an argument that sounds too good to be true, and finding, page by page, that it is not too good to be true at all. She read the 5th notebook's red-taped formula 3 times. She cross-referenced it against the surrounding notebooks. She made her own notes in her own notebook. She asked Edmund questions about the physical condition of the fire-clay box and the manner in which it had been sealed, which he answered precisely and in full, and she noted his answers with the expression of someone whose hypothesis is being confirmed rather than challenged. She sat at the workbench at the end of that day and said that the composition described was a borosilicate glass that, if the formula was accurate, would outperform the commercial equivalents available in Ferris's era in both heat resistance and optical clarity. She said the formula showed 40 years of refinement behind it. She said that nobody in the scientific glass community had any record of this composition having been published or known to the field. She said it was, to her knowledge, a previously unknown piece of materials science history that had been sealed in a firebox for 60 years while the field had worked around the limitations it would have solved. She said she would need to make samples to confirm the formula's accuracy. Edmund said, "I can make the samples." She looked at him. He said, "That is what I do." He made the samples across 3 sessions at the torch over the following week, following the formula precisely and noting where the material's behavior matched or diverged from Ferris's working notes. It matched. The glass produced was clearer than commercial borosilicate and demonstrably more stable at the temperatures Ferris had specified. Priya submitted her paper to the Materials Journal 6 weeks later. It ran with a supplementary note on the discovery and the workshop and the manner of preservation, and with Edmund's samples documented in the methodology. The paper credited August Ferris and the Harwick Fen workshop, and in the acknowledgment section that Priya had written herself and shown Edmund before submission, acknowledged Edmund's role in finding and making available the formula that the field had not known it was missing. The Heritage Craft Foundation contacted Edmund the week after the paper was published. The designation of the workshop as a site of scientific and craft heritage came 2 months later, with a restoration grant that funded the complete recommissioning of the Glory Hole furnace and the establishment of a formal apprenticeship program for scientific glassblowing, the first of its kind in the region. The furnace was lit for the first time in 60 years on a Thursday morning in November, with Orla and Nell and Jasper present and the Ferris fish arranged along the windowsill in their line of 12. The glass figure of the seated woman among them, where Edmund had placed her at the beginning. He opened the primary air valve first, and then the gas, and lit the furnace with the long match, the way he had always lit furnaces, with the particular respect that fire required, standing back slightly, and watching the flame take before he came closer. The furnace heated slowly, the refractory brick absorbing the temperature at the rate of its own material logic, the heat building in the chamber by degrees. Edmund checked the temperature at intervals with the pyrometer, and said nothing. Orla stood near the door with her arms crossed. Nell sat on the workbench stool with her notebook open. Jasper stood beside the furnace and watched the temperature climb. When the furnace reached working temperature, Edmund opened the glory hole and looked into the chamber. The interior was incandescent, the heat visible as light, the air above the opening shimmering. He looked at it for a long moment. He said, "Good." He looked over at the window-sill where the 12 fish were arranged in their line, the glass figure among them. The morning light from the north skylight came through them all and threw their color onto the white wall behind, small pools of warmth in the steady, cool light of the workshop. He picked up a gather rod and began. Conrad arrived on a Saturday in December. He walked through the workshop slowly, the way a person walked through a space they were trying to understand rather than assess. He looked at the Ferris fish arranged along the window-sill and at the glass figure among them, and he stood in front of her for a moment, the morning light coming through her from the north skylight, before he moved on. He looked at the notebooks in their display case. He looked at the furnace running in the back wall, the heat visible at the glory hole opening, the air above it shimmering. He looked at Jasper at the workbench, pulling a glass tube with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been taught well and was practicing what he had been taught. He looked at Nell at the other end of the bench, writing up a commission specification with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly what was needed. He stood in the center of the workshop and looked at his father. He said, "I did not know you were still this." Edmund was at the torch, finishing a piece. He set it in the annealing kiln before he turned. He said, "I have always been this. You removed the conditions for it. You did not remove the thing itself." Conrad said nothing for a moment. He looked at the workbench and at the tools laid out along it, and at the glass marble, which Edmund had placed at the corner of the bench when he lit the torch that morning, and which sat there in the skylight with its cobalt blue catching the steady northern light. He said, "Is that the marble?" Edmund said, "Yes." Conrad had heard about the marble his entire life. He had heard it described and had seen it in his father's hand on many occasions without understanding what it was beyond a piece of glass. And now he stood in front of it on the workbench in the workshop, where everything that had followed it had led, and something moved through his face that was not quick and was not simple. He said, "I am sorry, Dad." Not the sorry of a man presenting a case, the sorry of a man who had looked at something clearly for the first time and had found it larger than he had thought. Edmund said, "Come back. There is a great deal here worth understanding. August Ferris built something in this room for 40 years, and nobody knew it until it had been sealed in the firebox for 60 years more. I do not intend for that to happen to this place again. You should understand what that means, and why it matters." Conrad said he would come back. He came back the following 2 Saturdays and the Saturday after that, and each time he stayed longer and said less and watched more, and on the 4th Saturday he asked Edmund if he could try pulling a glass rod at the cold torch, which was the exercise Edmund gave every beginner on their first day. Edmund showed him. Conrad was not good at it. His hands were not patient in the right way, and his instinct was to push rather than to follow. But he tried, and he kept trying when his first several attempts did not go as intended, and Edmund watched his son sit at the cold torch with a glass rod and apply himself to learning something for which he had no natural aptitude with more genuine effort than Edmund had seen from him in 30 years. He said nothing about this, but he noted it. Beatrix called on a Sunday evening in January, the particular kind of call that a person makes when they have been working toward it for a long time and have finally decided that the working toward it is harder than making it. Her voice was not quite steady, and she did not try to make it so. She said she was sorry. She said she had known in the car and in every week since, and that she had been trying to find words adequate to it and had run out of reasons to keep waiting for adequate. Edmund said, "Beatrix, the door here is open. Come and see what is here. There is something on the window-sill I want to show you." She came the following weekend. She stood at the window-sill in the morning light with the glass figure in her hands for a long time, the woman reading, the north skylight coming through her and falling warmly on Beatrix's face and hands. She said, "She looks peaceful." Edmund said, "Yes." She said, "Who was she?" He said, "Nobody knows. Ferris made her and sealed her in the firebox for 60 years. I think he made her for himself. Something he needed in the room while he worked." Beatrix looked at her for another long moment. She said, "I think I understand that." She set the figure back on the window-sill carefully in exactly the position it had been in, and turned to look at the workshop. The two of them arrived in February, a man and a woman in their late 20s, referred by Jasper's former support worker who had heard about the apprenticeship program. They came in the morning and stood in the workshop doorway and looked at the furnace and the workbench and the fish on the window-sill and the glass figure among them and at Edmund at the torch, and Jasper beside him, watching with the complete still attention of someone who has found the thing they were looking for. Edmund looked up from the torch. He said, "Come in. The furnace is warm and there is a great deal to learn." They came in. The man went straight to the workbench and looked at the Ferris fish without touching them. He looked at each one in turn, the way a person looked at something they had not expected to find, and were trying to understand the quality of. He came to the glass figure at the end of the line and stopped. He said, "What is she?" Edmund said, "She was made by the man who built this workshop. He sealed her in the firebox with his notebooks and his formulas and his fish, and she waited 60 years for someone to find her." The man looked at her for a moment. He said, "Why a woman reading?" Edmund said, "Nobody knows. I have been thinking about it since I found her, and I have a theory, but it is only a theory." The man said, "What is your theory?" Edmund said, "I think he made her for the same reason I carry that marble." So there was something in the room that understood what he was doing, something that was paying attention. He reached into his trouser pocket and set the marble on the workbench beside the glass figure, the cobalt blue catching the north light alongside the glass of her, the two small-made things that had traveled the longest distances to be here. The man looked at the marble and the figure side by side for a moment. Then he looked at Edmund. He said, "Can you teach us?" Edmund said, "That is why the door is open." The furnace was warm, and the glass was in the fire, and the light through the north skylight was exactly what it had always been, and Edmund understood, finally, that some things did not end. They only waited for the right pair of hands to come back to them. We would like to know what in Edmund's story found you, and we would like you to share it in the comments below. If you know someone whose hands remember something the world tried to take from them, share this with them today. Some workshops are not abandoned. They are only waiting. We will be here with another story, and the door, as it always is, will be open.